And we're doing it live. Welcome, everybody.
Welcome, everybody.
I am joined by the talented and immortal,
Scott Wilson.
and I am Stevie Stroh, and we are here for episode 31. What are we going to talk about this week, Scott T. Wilson?
We're going to be talking about The Last of Us based on the very popular and I think acclaimed video game.
Yeah, and this is, I think it was episode 19 when we talked about video games, and I'm pretty sure I mentioned this, but one of the things that I'm not a fan of in video gamedom are console exclusives because not everybody owns every console. And this is an example of one. So The Last of Us is a game for the PlayStation. I think it came out in 2013. Or I don't it's not brand new, but it's not super old. And it's a PlayStation exclusive. It's through Naughty Dog Studios. Since I have never owned a PlayStation, I have never seen or played this game. And this is not the first time there's been a live action adaptation of a video game. And this is kind of, depending on your threshold for pain, so there's been some hits and some misses on live action video game adaptations. I would say so far, based on what I'm seeing, this is great live action. Even though I have not seen the game, for me, ignorance is bliss. I can just watch the show on its own merits and hopefully enjoy it. But it's great live action.
Well, I actually purchased the game on somebody's recommendation when the pandemic first started in about the spring of 2020. And I can't remember much about it. I purchased a lot of games during that time because the job I had at that time, they basically had us stay home for about 3 to 4 weeks. So I had to find ways to occupy my time. I ended up playing Streets of Rage. Was it 3 or 4? What
The
was the
new,
last one that came
the
out?
new
The
one,
new
the,
one.
the new
Yeah.
one, yeah, like the modern reimagining. Yeah, Streets of Rage 4.
Yeah, I ended up playing that one like almost to the exclusion of all the other games I bought during that time. But I remember The Last of Us being very impressive on a story level. It was very story and drama heavy.
Okay, we just got a live chat from Scott Host on YouTube saying I've never played the game, but I am going to watch the series. So we should probably tell you, Scott, and everybody else when we talk about things, what's the 2 words that we have to tell everyone?
Spoilers.
Spoiler alert. Yes, so we have both seen episode 1. I've actually now seen episode 1 and episode 2. We'll focus on episode 1. But yeah, there will be some spoilers. Actually, one of the things I want to read because I came across this article. This comes from IGN, and they reviewed this and they gave it a 9. And so they said, anchored by 2 outstanding lead performances from Bella Ramsey and Pedro Pascal, The Last of Us delivers an enriching show for fans while also managing to stay welcomingly thrilling to newcomers. And the subtitle to that is HBO's The Last of Us is a breathtaking adaptation of one of the most impactful stories told in video games and brilliantly brings Joel and Ellie's journey to a whole new audience. It successfully builds out the world of the game while also switching up some aspects to almost an entirely stunning effect. And your screen is really freaking out. You're giving me like a seizure right now, Scott Wilson. Are you experimenting with any type of hallucinogenics right now, by any
N-
chance?
no, sir. Hope you can still hear me.
I can hear you, but your screen is like flashing green on me. It's freaking me out, man. It's coming and going, but it's all good. Yeah, that's Scott Wilson who's giving us the seizure there. Scott Host on YouTube Live. You just stop blinking on us, Scott. Hopefully we'll
Yeah,
stay
that's
that way.
yeah.
Um,
Unfortunately, that's my laptop doesn't seem to like me very much right now. So trying to bear with it.
Yeah. So this is the problem. I think with anything, when you do an adaptation, and we can use comic books, the superhero spectacle, you're never going to please everybody, right? So bear that in mind. This is live action retelling of a video game story that is it's safe to say it's similar to a zombie apocalypse, although they're not technically your traditional Walking Dead zombies, but they are. They call them the infected, and
Right.
it's an
It's
interesting way in how they're infected too. Sorry to cut you off, Scott. Go ahead.
well, yeah. They don't even really make it clear if they're undead or if they're zombies at all. Spoiler alert. It seems to be the infection seems to be born of fungus, a fungus of some kind. And you don't even really necessarily get a great look at, oh, here I go blinking again.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily get a great look at, hold on a second. Hold on a second here.
Well, you do visually. We get to see what they, especially in episode 2. You haven't seen episode 2 yet.
No,
So
no.
episode 2, we get to see a look at them. But what they are doing, so in the series, they're called the Infected, and so they're similar. If you've ever watched insert zombie apocalypse movie or series here, they're similar to the zombies in The Walking Dead or whatever other post-apocalyptic show you watch. But there is some kind of science fact to how they are. Been zombified, and like you said, it's through a fungus, it's through these spores, and there is real life stuff in nature where there are like certain spiders that have been taken over by a fungus,
Right.
where the spider is literally a living zombie, and the fungus is controlling its body to make it do what it wants. So this actually occurs in nature, and in one of the opening scenes, they were talking about they had like some type of TED talk from 1968, and talking about how these funguses could possibly how this could possibly happen. And one of the things that they were saying then was, well, fungus spores cannot survive over a certain temperature. So they couldn't survive in the human body because our body temperature, is or whatever, 98.6. But the guy theorized back in 1968, well, what happened if the climate was to change and the earth was to get warmer, and these fungi adapted to living in warmer climates? Because when you think about mushrooms, they typically grow in the shade, right? So mushrooms are not in direct sunlight. So a lot of these things grow in damper, cooler, darker areas. But like all things in nature, they adapt. They evolve. They all that kind of stuff. So if these fungus evolved to be able to survive in warmer body temperatures, could they potentially take over humans? That's kind of the premise of what's going on here. Really interesting.
Right. One of the things I got to say this at the top of the show. I'm not the biggest zombie guy in the world. I lost interest in The Walking Dead pretty fast. The only thing with zombies in it that I was ever a real fan of was the original George Romero Dead trilogy for Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead. I'm a big fan of those films,
Right.
but zombies in general never really did it for me. So I don't know if you remember, maybe about a decade ago, when we had this huge zombie craze where The Walking Dead kicked off
Yeah.
like this whole wave of you had a bunch of novels, Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies. You had Abraham Lincoln Zombie Killer. You had and the
Well,
poppy
Abraham Lincoln was vampire killer.
Vampire Killer, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
but close enough. Yeah.
Yeah, but you had all these zombie themed things, and I kind of just had no interest. Like I said, I watched the first season of The Walking Dead was okay. The second and third approached being actually good. This I never found the series really satisfying, and I found it kind of repetitive. Um, but I'll say at the top of the show, I'll say this: the approach this show has, by the end of the first episode, it grabbed me. It's like, okay, I want to see where this is going. I want to
Yes.
see where we're heading.
Yeah. Well, let me just say a couple things about the zombie genre and The Walking Dead in particular, because you might get some scathing hate mail by saying you're not a fan of The Walking Dead from the
Yeah,
geek armies. But hey, Johnny Moore is out there. J.R. Morgan is out there from J.R. Morgan Productions. How you doing, movie man?
J.R. Morgan.
So
And
yes.
shout out to yeah, Scott Host and J.R. Morgan Productions, guys. Thanks for joining us tonight.
I will say this: I do like The Walking Dead. I'm behind on the seasons, and I like it for two reasons. Number one, the special and practical effects they do with the zombies themselves. Each new season what kind of new zombie are we going to get? Are we going to get the swamp zombies? Are we going to get the flaming zombies? You know, so they keep kind of pushing that envelope on the way they're presenting the zombies. So, but what I did like about The Walking Dead was that the zombies were almost a consequence, but the story is about the survivors and the human struggle, right? So the experiment that The Walking Dead showed us, which in a way we kind of went through a small version of that in 2020 with COVID. But what happens when all of the things we're used to, all these luxuries and all these things we're accustomed to having, what happens when civility fails? How long will humans be civilized to one another?
Right.
So what I do like about The Walking Dead and other like post-apocalyptic shows like your War of the Worlds and your Falling Skies and things like that is now we've become like martial law. We have, you know, all these different factions. You've got people who are no longer worried about saving humanity. They're just worried out to save themselves. So if you've got food, you've got shelter, I'm going to, you know, 86 your ass and take over what you got for me because I'm worried about me. So the whole concept of humanity kind of coming together to survive went out the window. Civility went out the window. So that experiment of what these zombie shows do, I find more interesting than the zombies themselves. And when the zombies do finally come out and you get a jump scare or you have something else, that's great. But the human struggle and how do we survive in these ridiculous scenarios that we're in, that's the interesting part to me of the genre, of the zombie genre when it's done right, you know.
Well, yeah, I know The Walking Dead. I know a lot of fans. They've always said that about it, that the humans are the real threat on the show, not so much the zombies. But again, I go back to the Romero films, especially Day of the Dead, which had a scenario where you had a bunch of people in like a bunker. It was some military guys with some scientists, and it kind of showed you how they got along or didn't get along, and just it showed you just how human beings, we don't really know when there's a crisis at hand, we don't always know how to look out for each other or how to look out for the group. Everybody has their own agenda, everybody's looking out for themselves.
Right. Right. So we have established that you're not a huge zombie genre fan, but you are liking The Last of Us so far.
Yeah, like look, even stuff that I'm not necessarily a fan of, I'm open to a version of it that I may enjoy. So, especially when I heard the word of mouth about how great the show was and how it finally breaks the word about the show is it finally breaks the video game curse. You know, when you have these uh media that are media that are adapted from video games, and you know, like the word, we've talked about this, we had a show about this,
Yeah.
that the word, the company line is that movies and TV shows and things based on video games usually aren't that good, and the word about this one is that it finally breaks the curse. And you know, that's up to interpretation, that's up to personal opinion, personal taste. I would say this is one of the first things based on a video game, one of the first multimedia experiences I've had was something based on a video game property where it felt truly like prestige television or like high level, like the story came first. It's not just leaning on familiarity with the IP. It's not just leaning on, are you a fan of the IP or Easter eggs dealing with the world of the IP. It has a compelling story in and of itself. You don't have to even care about the
Right,
source,
right.
you know.
Right. And that's like for me, ignorance is bliss because I had never seen or played the game. I just wanted to watch. Now, of course, you had me at the trailer. You know, when I saw the trailer for it on HBO Max, it looked really good. Obviously, fan of Pedro Pascal from Game of Thrones, from The Mandalorian, and now from The Last of Us. So Pedro Pascal, and dare I even say Wonder Woman 84.
Dare you not, dare you not.
So yeah, if you're into a lot of the modern sci-fi, fantasy, geeky type stuff, you know, Pedro Pascal has been dominating some really successful series now for probably a good 10 years. And he does a really good job in this. Now, on our Facebook page, I shared some pictures that have been coming through social media where they're showing shot by shot where they recreated, because a lot of video games are very cinematic now, and there's certain cut scenes and sequences where things happen. So there's like 8 or different shots where they showed the TV version, compared it to the video game version, and they're almost frame for frame the same scenes. And there's probably different schools of thought on that, where well, is that original enough, or is that, if you're a fan of the game, to be able to see that, as like, oh my god, that might give you the chills and
Oh,
the goosebumps, so.
before we continue, Scott Host has a question. Is that the one where they tried to make zombies weapons?
Is
Are you,
that
which
the
one are you, Scott
probably when
Host?
you were talking about your Living Dead one?
Oh yeah, Scott Host, say, are you asking about Day of the Dead? Like just type something and let us know that, because I can't remember the exact plot. I think it was like, military guys and scientists in a bunker, and they were running tests on zombies. Yeah,
Yeah, Romero.
and it, and they were running tests on zombies, and there was one. He's actually in the advertising material. He's on the poster that's holding a gun. I think, yeah, like I think they were trying to test, could they be trained, or does their intelligence evolve, or whatever. And in Land of the Dead, which kind of made the original trilogy a quadrilogy, like it was sort of a continuance of that theme, where you had zombies that seemed to be almost thinking. So yeah, I think Day of the Dead is that one.
Gotcha. So yeah, when you talk about, when you're taking something now that's based on a video game, and you're doing scene by scenes where you're recreating that video game scene in the show, what are your thoughts on that? Is that an homage? Is that too far? Is that to you, is that fan service? Is that disappointing? What do you think about that?
To be honest with you, is if it's well done and it's well integrated into the story, that kind of stuff doesn't really bother me. That's my only concern. Like, when you're going to adapt these things, don't just use familiarity as a crutch. If you're going to try to really tell a story with it, then put it in there in a way where it doesn't. Okay, to fans, to fans it may stick out. Excuse me. To fans it may stick out, but if you don't necessarily know the game, or maybe you just don't remember that part of the game, it just feels like an organic part of the storytelling. And that's how it felt to me. Like, nothing in this. Like I said, that was 2 years ago that I played the game, and I didn't really get too far in it. Nothing in this really stood out to me as, oh, I remember that from the game.
Okay.
But I was still entertained by it. So that's really what I care about.
Yeah, some of the headlines I remember reading prior to it dropping and releasing to be watched was that the creators of this show were going to try to be true to and stick to the source material of the game, and try to work within the context of the game world and characters, and not try to go too far out in different directions. And so one example where, we've got about a half a dozen movies, Resident Evil with Mila Jovovich, based on a very popular video game too. They brought in a lot of stuff from the games, but I think they went off in other directions too, and kind of embellished the world and added things to it that weren't in the game. And I think they made that statement in that headline, probably saying, we're not going to do what the Resident Evil franchise did. We're not going to stray too far. We're going to stick to the source material. Obviously, when you're doing live action and you're doing adaptation, you're not going to do everything verbatim. And I think there already are some changes that not all fans are crazy about. But I think one of the changes, and you haven't seen episode 2, so I don't know if you want me to tell you yet, Scott.
No,
About
please,
Okay,
please don't.
so there is a change that becomes revealed in episode 2, and if you watch the entire episode and you get past the credits, it will automatically start rolling some, like, behind the scenes discussions. So I'd say stick around to the end of the show and watch that post credit segment. It's about a good 10 minutes where they talk about everything they did in the episode, and how some of the things in that episode have changed from the fabric of the game, but why they did it. And for the live action version of it, it really makes a lot of sense. And it is all tied into now science fact on what's going on with all of the fungal things that these infected people are based upon. So I thought whatever the changes were, since I didn't play the game, I have no problem with what I've seen in the first 2 episodes of the series so far.
Well, that's the thing. People forget that an adaptation people have this, a lot of times fans, geeks, nerds, whatever you want to call us, we have this thing in our heads that we believe that every adaptation should be about, first and foremost, 100% fidelity with the source material. That's not really how these things work. Video games and movies are two different mediums. Comic books and movies are two different mediums. Books and movies are two different mediums. Plays and movies are two different mediums, and so on and so forth.
Right.
And an adaptation is really about, you know, you try to retain, depending on what the directors or the producers or the writers or whoever want to do, you try to retain the spirit of the original property, but you don't necessarily have to stick chapter and verse. You don't have to use the original property as sort of a Bible. You don't have to necessarily do it that way. You can make changes. You can eliminate certain characters. You can make composite characters. You can
Right.
change
Exactly. Exactly.
plot threads,
Right. Right. Like, speaking of which, one of the most popular characters in The Walking Dead wasn't in the original. It was, I guess it's Daryl, Norman Reedus. His character wasn't in the graphic novel at all. And he is now one of the most popular characters in the show. And, Walking Dead is famous for killing off beloved characters season after season, like kind of like Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones would kill off characters left and right. And so you don't get too attached to anybody, because nobody's life is guaranteed in shows like this. But yeah, so Daryl, Norman Reedus' character, was completely created for the live action version of The Walking Dead. He was never in the graphic novel version. So that's one example, and he became the fan favorite. So it can work where fans will be on board if it's done well. To me, it's all about the experience. If you're watching something and it's quality entertainment, who cares? Who cares if it's exactly the same, or if it's different, or if it breaks continuity, whatever. If is this a ride? If I'm at a theme park, am I enjoying this ride? Then heck, I got my money's worth on this ride.
right. And also, just before we move any further, just letting any listeners we may have out there who have a problem with what I said about Walking Dead the show, um, I just like to let you guys know that I read the first three volumes of the comic about 2 or 3 years before the show ever aired. So yeah, the trade paperback. I
Right.
remember when I was a correction officer, I remember we weren't supposed to bring anything into the jail, you, but I used to smuggle those in and read them, during my downtime, depending on what post I had. And I read like the first one, two, or three trade paperbacks, I think. So I'm not speaking out of complete ignorance. I'm not coming to this just as the guy that doesn't like zombie stuff. Like, I mean, the main reason I even looked at the show was not just because of the comics, but because Frank Darabont, the guy who wrote and I think he wrote and directed Shawshank Redemption, The Green Mile, uh, The Mist, the adaptation of Stephen King's short story, I think it is. Yeah, but he was, and also I think one of the guys behind Nightmare on Elm Street 3, I think. I might be getting that wrong. But yeah, like I was a big fan of his. So and that first episode, I remember the first episode because I think it was aired as like almost a short movie, or almost as a TV movie. I thought like I enjoyed that. But yeah. Anyway, let's continue
All
with The
right.
Last of Us.
So, any any particular moments, breakout moments, anything in particular that stood out for you?
Well, before we continue, Scott Host and JP Morgan Productions, you may want to close your ears
Spoiler
for a brief
alert.
moment. Yeah, spoiler alert. Um, there's one moment toward the end, very end, where the main character had PTSD from something that happened earlier in the show, and he snapped. I'm not gonna say exactly what it is
Right.
because that kind of, I think people need to see that moment and be
Right.
affected by it. But something happens to him in the beginning of the show, something very, very traumatic and horrible, and something that not I don't think anybody would want to go through. And then something that reminds him of it, or happens, or is about to. He feels like it's about to happen again, and he's not going to let it happen, and he just snaps, and it's just I'm always I'm always kind of grabbed by good portrayals of PTSD and anxiety and things like that because those things really humanize characters for me. And then after that happened, it really put me on that character's side. Like I was like, okay, I want to follow. I want to see what where this guy goes and what happens to him.
Here, here. Yeah, and I liked where we were brought into this world, and you kind of get to see the beginning of the apocalypse, and nobody knows what's going on. So, the first act is the kind of backstory to how did we end up in this, well, we'll call it zombie apocalypse, but how did we ended up in this post-apocalyptic world. So we kind of see the beginning of that, and there's some really interesting scenes portraying people when they first get infected. I won't say who or how or where, but seeing some of those first infected people kind of leap into action and try to suck brains, to use a zombie analogy. I thought that was kind of interesting too, because it's things we've seen in the zombie genre, but now we're seeing it in the Last of Us genre. And we're not going to call them zombies, we're going to call them infected, because that's what they're known as in the series. But yeah, to see some of the first generation people get infected for the first time, and how that infection affects what they do, and how they, basically zoom in and want to kill the first living thing they see, was interesting. And then, of course, having it fast forward to the post-apocalypse, and just like in anything else, what you see in The Walking Dead or other things like that, you end up in this martial law situation where you kind of have this state or country police controlling the world, and then how do we live within that, where you've basically got a bunch of soldiers controlling everything. We've got curfews, and now you've got, basically everybody else is dealing with, black market stuff. How am I going to get medicine? How am I going to get food? All the challenges now that you need to interact and implement in this new world. You're just getting slices of this world was really interesting. And by the way, the first episode of The Last of Us is almost like a double episode. It's like it's
Yeah,
2 hours. It is two
yeah,
hours.
yeah. This is to address something Scott Host just said. He mentions the Omega Man, which is when I went on a binge of '70s movies a few months back, and that was one of the ones I watched is Omega Man. And I really enjoy that movie. It's kind of really cheesy and campy in a lot of ways. It's one of the many adaptations of I Am Legend, the novel.
Okay.
I think that might be the second or third one that they did. There was one with Vincent Price.
And Charlton Heston did one of them too, right?
That
Who?
that's the one. That's the one. The Omega
Okay.
Man.
Okay.
The Omega Man, and like I said, it's kind of really cheesy and campy, but it's kind of a lot of fun to watch. Charlton Heston had like a you know
Soylent
he,
Green, Planet of the
so
Apes.
yeah, but it's funny. There's a certain level of cheese in Camp and Planet of the Apes, but I think Planet of the Apes is the best film of that bunch. Soylent Green is also cheesy and campy, but Planet of the Apes is my very favorite of the Charlton Heston sort of sci-fi apocalyptic sci-fi movies.
Yeah.
But they're all enjoyable. They're all enjoyable.
Yeah. Yeah.
But uh,
So, I mean, I don't know how much more detail you want to get into this. Would you say, are you liking it so far? Would you recommend it? Would you give it a thumbs up?
yeah, no, I would give it. No, that's pretty easy. I would give it a thumbs up. I mean, it's if like I said, if this wasn't based on anything and I just happened to catch this one night on cable or something,
Right.
I would be interested. It would have me from the first episode. Like this is starting out strong. And like yeah, like more than anything else, more than the Resident Evil movies. If you want to find something else to make a direct comparison to that both are based on video games that deal with The Walking Dead or some form of Walking Dead or
The undead,
you know,
living dead, whatever you want to call them. Sure.
yeah, like yeah, this is clearly made by people who care.
Yeah, and it's very gritty, ground level, almost like Saving Private Ryan, like it's very guerrilla warfare style camera work, and the world that we're creating. This is survivalism at its roughest. So yeah, good stuff. It's yeah, I'm along for the ride. I want to see where it goes. I'm enjoying it. It's quality entertainment. It's gritty. It's violent. It's dealing with a lot of cool stuff. So, but it's got the whole semi sci-fi element to it. But the sci-fi infected enemies that we're dealing with are really based very much in science fact. It's only a couple of steps down the road from what's already happening in nature, how there are different fungus who are taking over living things and taking over their mind and controlling their bodies. This is already happening. We're just imagining, a few steps down the road, could this happen to humanity? And in this world, they've envisioned that as being the problem. So it's kind of interesting because you don't really know what made The Walking Dead start walking. It just happens, and you just know that if you get bit, you're going to become a zombie. If you die, you're going to become a zombie. But why? We have a why here, and the why is very much organic, biologically, science facty based, which is refreshing.
Well, and I also like the fact that the this pandemic or apocalypse happens due to human error in assuming that it could never happen. Assuming, I like how it opens with the expert, telling the audience, they're the two experts debating, and one of them is basically saying, but what if it could? And the other guy's rolling his eyes. He's like, no, but what if it could?
Right,
And
right.
that's exactly what happens.
Fair enough. Do we need to beat this horse anymore, or are we going to let it rest?
I think for now, I mean, I think we should either revisit this during mid-season. We can look up how many episodes there are going to be,
Mm,
or revisit it at the end.
yeah,
Either or. We can decide that. But yeah, no, this is a solid show. This is a
yeah.
solid show.
And I want to draw a comparison to a movie based on a video game that I was not a fan of and that I kind of fanboy hated on, but the newer Tomb Raider movie. So the first Tomb Raider movie with Angelina Jolie wasn't based on any particular game. It was based on the franchise and the character and the property. And I felt that that movie really embodied and captured a lot of the essence of what Lara Croft was across, 15 years of video games at that point in time. Now in 2018, they did a new movie, Lara Croft, based on the 2013 origin story game. And again, in the trailer, they show a lot of scenes that were pulled straight from the game. So if you're a fan of the game, and I've been a fan of Lara Croft and Tomb Raider forever, you want to see it. But unfortunately, those were there to basically lure people into thinking the movie was going to be anywhere near as good as the game, and it really wasn't. And at the time, I was really disappointed because of the fact they made so many changes. They really kind of neutered the bad guy. They neutered the supernatural force behind the whole story. And Laura Croft was kind of like an Indiana Jones, and Indiana Jones movies are best when they're dealing with supernatural and powers of God type things. And they kind of took all of that away. And so it was a really disappointing version of the video game. So as a fan of the video game, I absolutely did not like what they did with that movie. It took me a little while to get over that butt hurt. And now I can just watch the movie and say, yeah, it's a decent movie, but it's a shitty version of the game. So I can understand where fans can hate on something because it's like sacred ground. Like, oh my God, this game was so great. And now you've taken this powerful, wonderful thing of mine and just completely turned it into this marshmallow fluff.
Right,
you know,
right, right,
so
right.
I can see from there. And so I would not want to be in this business of doing these type of adaptations.
No, I think it's well, I think with video game adaptations, I think one of the hardest things is that video games are interactive. You play them.
Right.
That component is lost when you adapt it into something that you just watch.
Right.
Even though we always say that video games are closer to movies now than anything else, but there's still a difference between both forms. One is an activity. Uh, I guess they're both activities, but one is a bit more.
One's completely passive, where the other one's
Yeah,
got is passive and slash interactive. Yeah.
yeah. So no, but I'm yeah, no, I'm looking forward to that second episode. This is I think by the time this first season is over, I think it's going to be hard for a lot of Walking Dead fans to feel the same way about that show. That's the prediction I'm making.
Okay, fair enough. So, what would you like to do next? Would you like to do How Did You Geek this week, or we want to cover some news? I only have a little bit of news.
Scott Host, no, the two episodes are out. Steve has seen both. I've only seen one.
Yeah,
I've only
and
seen the first one.
episode 3 will drop Sunday night, which is a couple
Yes.
days from now. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, we can do a little bit of news.
All right, so I just created this extremely high budget infographic production here to introduce news. So, world premiere on this.
It's time for News with Culture Goes Pop.
Yeah, you can tell there I spared all expense.
Right.
So, we talked about The Last of Us. Okay, now, another thing in the news. I thought this was kind of interesting, but this is a headline that's come through a few different sources. But Zoe Saldana, did I say her name right? Zoe Saldana?
Yes.
She has now been the first actress who has been in 4 movies that have crossed the $2 billion mark in the world box office. That's impressive. So she's the first actress to be in 4 movies that all gross more than $2 billion each. Way to go, Zoe.
Yeah, well now she's in the same company. I remember over 20 years ago, they were talking about Harrison Ford as being, I think, the highest grossing actor in history, and most of that was simply because he appeared in the Indiana Jones trilogy and the Star Wars trilogy.
Right. Well,
So, and then Sam Jackson, I think they said he was the highest grossing actor ever, simply because he's appeared in so much, including
what's in your wallet,
yeah,
motherfucker?
including, I mean, and Sam Jackson has not only the Marvel movies, but he had the Star Wars prequel trilogy.
True.
And
Yeah.
so yeah, no,
Yeah.
now Zoe Saldana is in that same company.
Right. So there's 2 Avatar movies and the last 2 Avenger End Games with the with her being part of the Guardians of the Galaxy and whatnot.
Yeah,
So
and Infinity War and Endgame.
yeah, yeah. And then another thing worth mentioning is that we recently had passing, rest in peace, of Lisa Marie Presley, daughter of Elvis Presley. I don't know if we call Elvis Presley the king of rock and roll, but they called him, he's obviously a well-known person of musical history. But yeah, we just lost Lisa Marie not too long ago. And it's kind of, the timing couldn't have been worse too, because I just finished watching the Elvis biopic on HBO like a week or so ago, and there are scenes where Priscilla's still a baby and a little girl and things like that. And I remember seeing Priscilla on an MTV. I remember when she married Michael Jackson, and she had a music career of her own, and unfortunately she was no longer with us. So I'll just say rest in peace, Lisa Marie.
Yeah, I mean, I mainly remember her. I remember when her and Michael Jackson got married. And I can't remember. There was some show that interviewed them both. And I remember her being in the video for "You Are Not Alone," where she was covered in a towel, and it kind of was supposed to be a sexy moment. Was her and Michael kissing. Th Those are the main things I remember about her. I mean, from what I hear, she's a decent person.
Yeah, yeah.
From what I hear.
And I remember seeing a clip of her on David Letterman that they were showing, shortly after her passing too. And yeah, she was, yeah, as somebody who we didn't get to know as well, but is part of the legacy of the Elvis Presley, dynasty and estate and history and everything else. And one of I don't know if she was the last remaining heir. I'm not sure if I think Priscilla Presley's still alive, right? His wife.
I think so. I haven't heard from her in years.
Yeah, but it's interesting how she kind of became later on somewhat of a movie star. She was in some of those Naked Gun movies, and she was in
Right.
Ford Fairlane and a few things like that. So, yes, I don't know if Priscilla's still around, but Lisa Marie, unfortunately, is not. So, moment of silent meditation for Lisa Marie Presley. And that's really all the news that I have, other than, all some of the headlines that we kind of talked about when we were talking about The Last of Us. So here's another segment we do on this show. And again, I spared all expense on this little infographic audio production.
How did you geek this week?
That's right. Spared all expense. So how did you geek this week? Is this what we're going to be talking about? What we did in our off time between episodes. So Scott, you got anything cool you want to share with the world and what you've been doing in your spare time?
Well, I checked out a new comic series from Image Comics called Plush. It's kind of a weird, kind of horror comedy thing. It's about this guy who's, for all intents and purposes, seems to be something of either a loser or an underachiever or just a guy that has low self-esteem. And he suddenly is sort of chased and then adopted by a group of cannibals who dress up as plush characters.
Cannibals who dress up. When you say plush characters, like stuffed animals?
Yeah.
So they're dressing up in like mascot costumes, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And they're cannibals. And they're
Yep.
they're hunting down and whatever. And they're doing it that way, huh?
Yeah, it's got a very, it's not the kind of thing that's suited to all tastes. It has a very particular sense of humor. Um, but it's a kind of an intriguing read so far. Um,
Okay.
I just want to I want to put that out there. You know, this is Image Comics. This is not, if you're into superhero comics and stuff, this might not be your speed.
Okay. Oh, and I want to answer another question from Scott Host Live. Yeah, so you're watching me on my OG channel. Yeah, I did do that video on Raptor Call of Shadows. You're saying you're the guy who made that. We need to talk, and maybe we need to interview you and talk about that. Yeah, because that is a cool game I remember from back in the day, and I got a copy of it, I think, on Steam or GOG, and I tried playing with it. And I don't even think I did a good job playing it because I really sucked at the game. But Scott, yeah, you should reach out to me. I'm going to put my email in the live chat here. And yeah, let's talk, man. Reach out to me. Let's talk about you making that game. I have interviewed a lot of video game authors over the years and love to talk to you about that and other things and just get you on and talk about stuff. That would be awesome, Scott.
Yes, that actually, yeah. Thanks for returning the favor by checking out our show. That's much appreciated.
Absolutely. So you're reading an odd comic book. Anything else?
That's pretty much all I've really had time for this week. The job I have now doesn't always leave me a lot of time to geek out.
I hear
So,
you. I hear you. It is, yeah. It's like you have to like make time. So here's a few things that I've been doing in my geeky time in between things. So they're on Netflix and they're leaving Netflix, but the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man trilogy, I went ahead and I watched all three of those, and I had to fast forward through several parts of Spider-Man 3, but I really liked that Tobey Maguire Spider-Man trilogy. Sam Raimi directing, Tobey Maguire playing Peter Parker Spider-Man, and all of the other Kirsten Dunst, and I can't think of Norman and Harry Osborn, can't think of their names right now. James Franco, Willem Dafoe, right? So the Dr. Octopus, just a great trilogy. I really feel like Sam Raimi nailed the spirit of the original Stan Lee, Steve Ditko concept of Spider-Man, and Spider-Man being a teenager, high school kid from Queens, the whole nine yards, the whole J. Jonah Jameson, all that stuff, Daily Bugle. I just think that's wholesome quality entertainment. And when we were talking about action movies, we talked about this a little bit too, how it was filmed in New York and how the times of things happen stuff. But I just re-binged those, and I just feel like that was a great time. We can almost call that the golden age of superhero movies because that was, before the MCU. But they're leaving Netflix. I'm not sure where they're going to go because I don't think Marvel owns them just yet. I'm not sure where they're going. I've got them all on Blu-ray and stuff too. But that was one of the things I did. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that before I move on to a few more things.
well, I mean, not really. I mean,
Yeah.
I have those on Blu-ray as well. Not
Yeah.
part three. I have part one and two. But yeah, I don't know what deal Marvel has still going with Sony, if any.
Yeah.
So we'll just have to see.
Yeah, fair enough. Another thing I did is I finished listening to an audiobook again, The House of Prophecy, from author Glenn Dahlgren, who I've had the honor of interviewing a few times because he's asked me to do a review for his book. He wants me to just publish a review, and it had been so long since I'd listened to the book, and I don't have time to read. So I just finished listening to his book again, and so now I'm going to write a review for him. As a matter of fact, he recently just got interviewed from another person who does YouTube live interviews and Facebook live interviews. So I shared that interview with him on our Facebook page. So if you find us on Culture Goes Pop on Facebook, you can see that interview with Glenn. And it's shorter than the interviews that I've done with him. I've done 3 different interviews over the past 3 years to celebrate each one of his books when they came out. And this is a much more distilled 30-minute interview covering his whole bookology, I think. But yeah, it's a great book to listen to. So I listened to that. I do look forward to writing that review for Glenn, letting him know. Last week we talked about action movies, and one of the epiphanies I came up with was that the action movies seemed to be a statement of how we were in the world at that time. And I was mentioning that in the 80s, in real life, the 80s was kind of like our decade of decadence, and life in America was great. The country had lots of money. You could buy things. We had MTV. We had big gas guzzling cars. Things couldn't be better. So what were the movies about? We had tons of apocalyptic movies in the 80s because life was so good. We had to imagine a world that wasn't good. And that's what it seems like a lot of those ones. And to me, the one I just watched, because it came across, I've got a Fire Stick and you get these little thumbnails of things to watch. But I ended up watching The Running Man the other night from 1987 with Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'm sure you remember that movie, Scott.
Oh yeah, I watched that dozens of that came out when I was like 10 years old. I watched that. It's one of those movies I've seen so many times. It's just imprinted on my brain like a branding iron. I don't even have to watch it. I can just tell you every moment, every line of dialogue.
And it's so good. And the thing you realize when you watch these, even going back to like the Twilight Zone episodes and Star Trek and all these things, and even like, Richard Dawson, as Scott says, Richard Dawson, who was most known for being the nice, lovable guy from the Family Feud game show. So to see him play kind of a douchey character, at least off camera, he was douchey, was kind of interesting. But when you think about it, again, post-apocalyptic. Why? Because in the 80s, we were the exact opposite of the post-apocalyptic. We were almost a utopian society, right? And how the media can coerce information. Does that sound familiar now? Like, don't believe anything you see on the news because it's probably not. And how television is how we have to placate the masses and give them something to distract them from how bad life really is, and what we see on TV isn't what's really happening, and things like that, and how we can change the facts and make people seem guilty for the purpose of all this kind of stuff. All these things that seem to be so far-fetched. It's like, wait a minute. This is kind of happening right now in the real world. So I think that's always kind of interesting.
Right. No, like I said, it's just one of those movies. I always wanted to read the Stephen King novel that it was based on, that he wrote under a different pen name. I think it was Richard Bachman or something like that. I've always wanted to read that novel and see how it compares to the movie. There's already a few changes I'm aware of that the movie made, because they really tailored it to Arnold's sensibilities and strengths and what his audience wanted to see from him.
Yeah, but that's a great watch. And then the last thing I'll say, a little passion pet project that I've been working on, which feeds into what my main hobby has been forever. But I like video games, and I like old video games, and I've been doing vintage gaming and vintage computing for a while. And a lot of stuff I've been doing for the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years has really been focused on the 80s. I'm now moving into the 90s, and another kind of golden age time for me was playing with Windows 98 and all kinds of really cool games I had on the days of Windows 98. So, and it's kind of behind me. You can see it on camera here, but there's a big beige tower behind me against the wall there. And that is a Windows 98 PC that I've rebuilt from all old parts, and getting these things working with all the right hardware and all the right drivers to get all of the 3D graphics and the sound cards working and everything else. It's kind of hard to do to get the parts and to get the drivers, but I have now built a very similar version to the ultimate Windows 98 gaming PC I had back in the day. So I'm trying to recreate that. And the final couple pieces of that now is I've got a new power supply that's got kind of the LED lights on it. And I've got a case that's got a little hole on the side you can see through, so I'll be able to see some of the cool lights. So I'm going to build this in a slightly more modern, gangster, pimped out looking case, but it's going to be all old 90s hardware. And I've got all my old CDs from back in the game in the day too. So I'm looking forward to playing some old MS-DOS games like Duke Nukem and a bunch of Windows 98 games and things like that. So that's been a little pet project I've been working on. And when I have the rebuild and the repack on it, I'll probably do a couple of videos on the process of kind of rebuilding it and recasing it, and then showing off the system after it's up and running. So that's been my little pet project I've been doing for the past 2 weeks.
Okay, that's pretty cool. That's really cool, actually.
Yeah.
That sounds like something that a guy like you with laser focus can do. I don't. That's a bit too big an undertaking for me.
All right. Well, once it's up and running, we'll find some games we can play 2-player on. So.
Okay.
Yeah. No, that's cool. So yeah, I definitely think to summarize what this episode is all about, The Last of Us on HBO, that is a good time to watch. I would definitely suggest watching it. You don't even have to know what it's about. You don't have to know it's about a video game. You don't have to care about any of that. If you want to see a good action adventure, semi-sci-fi-ish show and lose yourself for a couple of hours, jump in and watch The Last of Us on HBO Max, now streaming.
Right. Definitely recommended. Definitely recommended.
Okay. Now, is there anything in particular you want to talk about in the near future? Have you finished watching the entire season of Willow?
Nope, I haven't gotten around to that yet, and that's kind of an issue because there's another show that I've been waiting on that's coming out on Hulu. Some rap fans may know about it. It's Wu-Tang and American Saga, the third and final season is coming out on
Okay.
Hulu. So I'm looking forward to that. I think that's in February. It's been over a year since season 2 ended. So I'm like the Wu-Tang Clan is my favorite group of all time. So I'm definitely looking forward to that one. And I'm also looking forward to, let's see. Well, okay, I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay.
I'll leave it at that for now.
Fair enough. One more thing I will say is that another thing I would recommend people to watch is Jack Ryan on Amazon Prime. We just finished watching season 3 now. And my wife was away for almost a week before this past weekend. And so while she was away, I couldn't finish watching the end of the season. So I watched a couple of the movies like The Hunt for Red October and the Patriot Games, which were also some Jack Ryan stories that came out in like the early 90s. So yeah, I'm kind of like hooked on this whole Jack Ryan thing, even though I'm late to the party. But the way Amazon Prime is doing it now with John, what's his name? John Krasinski. I'm probably butchering his last name, but he's from The Office. He plays Jack Ryan, and it's really good. Each season focuses on one threat, and it takes pretty much the entire season to... Spoiler alert, each one does have a happy ending. The terrorists don't win, thank God, right? But it takes the entire season to kind of solve the case. And there's a lot of cloak and dagger and intrigues and misdirects and things like that. But it's a really cool insight on counterterrorism and how how he's basically an analyst and how he's able to find out what these people are doing by following the money and tracking down, purchases and this and that and the other. So it's very reality military based. And it's really cool. So I was just like, as we were watching the last 2 episodes with me and my wife last night, I'm like, you know what? I bet you this is the funnest job to have to make these movies. You get to fly in helicopters and wear gear and shoot guns. It's like making that movie's got to be like an adult playground, and they're really fun to watch. And it's not your typical sci-fi geeky type thing. It's a little bit more kind of military and politically driven, but it's good. It's good drama. It's good action, and it always leaves you guessing until almost the last minute.
Right.
Yeah, so
Right.
give that one a suggestion too. Are we ready to wrap up this episode?
I think so.
All right, so we'll just say if you're watching us live or listening to us later, we are Culture Goes Pop. We designed this show to be a podcast for you to listen to. So if you listen to podcasts, give us a listen. If you haven't listened to podcasts, start listening to us, and you can catch that podcast wherever podcasts are available, including Apple Podcasts and Amazon Music and Podcasts and Anchor FM and Spotify and iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, wherever you listen to podcasts. Search for Culture Goes Pop. We are now on episode 31, so we have a lot of different things we've talked about in these past 6-7 months, and hopefully we'll have lots more to talk about. If you want to reach out to us on the show, you can send us an email to show@culturegoespop.com. And to find out where we live on all the various web platforms and social media platforms, you can just go to our website, culturegoespop.com, and all the links to wherever we are there. Anything else you want to say, Scott?
No, that says it all.
Okay, and Scott, host, thank you for watching, and I will look for your email and reach out to you. Definitely want to talk to you about the games you've done, past, present, future. Johnny Moe, thanks for stopping by, and to anybody who watches or listens later, thank you. Give us some feedback. Let us know what you thought about the show. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye, everybody.